Good afternoon. My name is Mike Heim, and I'm the Senior Energy Analyst for Noble Capital Markets. We're at the last meeting of the day here. Hopefully we'll have a little fun here. We've put together an energy panel. The title of the panel is Natural Resources Panel, Managing the Transition to a Greener Energy Environment. Today is especially symbolic. We have a new president as we speak. He's in the White House signing 17 executive orders, one of which is to put the U.S. back in the Paris Accord, joining over 200 countries and thousands of companies that have made a pledge to be carbon neutral by 2050. I know it's completely unfair to ask our panel to talk about what things are going to look like 30 years from now, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. We're seeing renewables growing at a faster rate than I think most people might have thought, and getting to the point that renewable costs are now comparative to others in terms of generation. We may be seeing a similar thing on the transportation side with electrical vehicles starting to take over. So to discuss this, we've put together a panel representing various fuels and various country locations as well. We have Doug Bartole, who's the CEO of InPlay Energy. They're a small light oil and gas producer in Western Canada. We have Frank Ingriselli, who's the CEO of Indonesia Energy. They're an expanding E&P company focusing on oil and perhaps later down the road on gas. We also have Paul Goranso, who represents enCore Energy, an emerging uranium producer, mining and producing company. And finally, we have Darren Jamison, President and CEO of Capstone Turbine, a producer of microturbines for distributed generation needs. I'm going to start right off by going a little bit off script. As I said, we've got a new president who's signing some executive orders. I mentioned the Paris Accord. Another one he's signing is revoking the permit for the Keystone oil pipeline. I know that's more heavy oil than light oil, but Doug is our Canadian representative. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of, I guess, a kick in the teeth. I know there's lots of commentary in Canada right now, and I think it's not a good start to Canada-U.S. relations. In general, it is mostly heavier crude that's supposed to go down that pipe to supply the Gulf Coast refiners that put on a bunch of front-end coking over the years to deal with the heavy oil. Now, with that said, those refineries are now made to take heavy crude. So if you don't get it from Canada, where are you getting it from? You're going to get it from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Russia. I mean, Canada's got some of the highest ESG standards, social conscience, standards and what we're doing in the world. And it is a significant slap in the face, and I think you're starting to hear it here that there's no not a good start to our relations. And you guys, I'll leave it to you guys, but you're going from one extreme to the other. And my personal view is your president sold his soul to the left devil to become the Democratic nominee, and now the president, and now he's going to stick to those roots, and we'll see how that works out for the long haul. But that's where we sit today.
We'll keep things international for a second and move over to you, Frank. Your company, Indonesia Energy, obviously in Indonesia, is also servicing a country that is making a move towards more renewable fuel. I wrote down that they've made a pledge of getting to 31% of their energy demand by renewable by 2050, and you're just in the point of expanding your exploration operations. Right. Well, how do you think that's even reasonable for a country like Indonesia that's got a little bit faster growth rate than maybe some of these other developed countries?
Sure. I mean, I think always to create goals like that is admirable. I think to make a stretch goal is something, a stretch target is something to be out there to achieve. Do I think they'll achieve it? No. Do I think they'll get close? Yes. And, right now, I think they're about 12% in the mix, about 12% renewable. But there's been a big push. The president Joko, who's been there now for a second term. He's committed to it. I think the country is committed to it. You see some things in like hydropower, solar. I just saw an announcement. I know this doesn't quite get them there, but the seriousness, Tesla battery maker is opening up, signed a $10 billion contract there. So, but again, the struggle with that is the growing demand. If you go and look at our company and one of our slides shows, and you've written about it, Michael, in some of your, write-ups on Indonesia oil. You've got 5% electricity growth, other demand for natural gas, other demand for oil. All those things are growing, sort of the non-renewables, the demand. And so as a growing economy, to grow even more towards the renewables will be a challenge. But, I went and researched some of this, and I find about 50% of the writers think they can get close. 50% think they can't get there. So to me, that says they'll get pretty close to there by 2050. It's a long time, but, I think it's achievable. But the country is growing, which is a good thing. And, they've opened up the investment opportunities to smaller entrepreneurial companies in the country, like the U.S. did in the shale revolution. So, U.S. got, I know it's a different thing, but we got to self-sufficiency. We produce more than we need right at this point. And, if a country puts their wherewithal to it and makes legislative incentives, they might be able to get there on renewable energy. So, I'm optimistic to get 75% there.
You made a good point talking about growth, that it's easy to talk about market share, and admittedly, renewables are going to take up market share, but that doesn't mean the absolute levels of fuel being used, oil, whatnot. And Paul, let me bring you in talking about uranium and nuclear, because you're pretty optimistic about the future of nuclear, not only in terms of growing, but maybe even growing market share. What do you see the role of nuclear, given that renewables is growing?
Well, nuclear is going to be there because it is a baseload electricity generator, and it's also doesn't have the emissions that one gets from other sources of power. And so we see growth occurring in China, India. India just started up this week their first indigenous reactor. And so that's big news for over there. So we see a lot of growth on the nuclear side as these economies, particularly in the Asia and even Saudi Arabia, et cetera, where they're looking at future growth, but also future sources of clean power. So we see a lot of demand happening. In the U.S., particularly with the new Biden administration, there is obviously they've set clean or at least carbon emission objectives. And in their objectives, they say they get there with the existing nuclear fleet, which constitutes about 20% of the domestic generation capacity. And so in order, but there's also opportunities for growth too. As we've got 2 new reactors starting up sometime by 2025. And now in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is saying that we should be looking at, instead of doing 20-year licenses for nuclear power plants, expanding those to 100-year licenses. Now we've got such a long safety track record, and even though today we don't see a lot of excitement about building a bunch of nuclear power plants in the U.S. like we did back in 2006 during the nuclear renaissance, there is expectation that will change with this new administration.
And we've talked about relicensing and how sometimes there's an increased uranium demand as successful plants are relicensed.
That's correct. And what we've seen is that not only do they get relicensed and have their licenses extended, they're also getting uprates. So the uprates on power generation. And that is for I think a rule of thumb is for like every 3 uprates that are approved, it's equivalent to 1 new reactor being put into service. And what we've seen is that when I look at it from the consumption side, that's for uranium, even though 10 years ago we had 114 reactors operating in the United States, now we're down to 94. the consumption of uranium is almost the same. And the reason why is because some of those reactors that shut down were small reactors that were uneconomic in the current deregulated, the merchant power grids that we have right now, but also the fact that they're just operating much more efficiently now.
Darren, let me get you in here. You're a little bit different from the others. Instead of talking about a fuel to feed large utility generations, you've got a different approach with more of a distributed generation. Just tell the audience a little bit more what your product does.
Absolutely. No, Capsule Microturbine, we actually operate kind of in both markets. We are in oil and gas. We're also in energy efficiency. We kind of convert fuels into electricity and thermal energy. Our goal is to lower customers' utility costs behind the meter. So distributed generation, base loaded 24/7, 365. We also offer backup power for resiliency as well. But we can take natural gas as an input fuel, diesel, biodiesel, kerosene. We do biogas, whether that's cow manure, chicken manure, pig manure, agricultural waste, as well as landfill gas and wastewater treatment plant gas. And then we're moving toward, in the future, hydrogen. We've got a hydrogen blended product right now with natural gas, moving to 100% hydrogen. So we can be running in the oil patch in a midstream operation on associated gas instead of flaring that gas and creating energy in the oil patch to decarbonize the oil patch and lower their carbon footprint, help with their ESG score, or we can be running at a hotel or an industrial application, helping save them money and saving the environment. So last 2 years, we saved our customers about $500 million in energy costs and about 718,000 tons of carbon.
Now, we talked a little bit at your presentation yesterday about your product can work off the grid or in conjunction with the grid. At this point, you're not selling back into the grid anywhere, are you?
We are in certain parts of the world, depending on the input fuel. So if we are using biogas or renewable gas, then we can sell into the grid. But here in the U.S., if we're running on natural gas, we're not allowed to sell back into the grid. That is correct. But if it's landfill, wastewater treatment plants, or other fuels, we're allowed to do that.
We also do. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say we also talked about the potential downward spiral as more and more customers leave the grid and the utilities are forced to recoup their expenses from a smaller and smaller number. Again, unfair to do, but look 30 years out, do you see distributed generation as being a complement to large utility generation, or is it going to be a competitor?
I think it depends how forward-looking the utility is. If the utility is smart, and we've seen some utilities do that, where they try to encourage generation in areas where they've got congested areas or have an inability to meet customer demands. A lot of customers come to us because they go to the utility and they need another megawatt of service and they can't get it for a year and it's $1 million, right? And that doesn't work in today's environment. Or they've got an unreliable utility that lose power frequently, or just the cost of their energy are going up every year and it's their third biggest spend and they just can't stay competitive in a global market with the cost of the utility continuing to go up. And so I think we can be complementary. I think obviously natural gas utilities love us because we're converting an electric user to a natural gas user. But I think there is a room to play with utilities. Also, we've got rental equipment, portable equipment. There's things we can do for grid outages, or like here in California for the fires. There's definitely ways to work kind of hand in glove with the utility if they're forward thinking enough.
Doug, let me bring you back in here because you do both gas or oil and gas here, and for the longest time the AGA has talked about gas being the bridge to the future, and it's picked up market share and generation and other. But again, as renewables start growing, do you see a shift in what you're doing towards gas over the next couple decades?
I think gas continues to have a decent future, for a few reasons. And I think this is a tough year to figure stuff out with the demand destruction from COVID-19 that occurred, and all the associated gas from shut-in oil and less oil. But I still think you're just getting started on the LNG front, and China's going to be building more LNG facilities. They're working on that. The U.S. is basically running at 100% capacity on the feedstock into the facilities right now. They're pushing 11 BCF a day. Like no one ever thought that. And that's what's keeping gas prices up. So Canada's going to actually start exporting LNG here in the next few years as well. And there's other places. Saudi Arabia is looking at it. It's still a cheap, clean fuel source at this point in time compared to coal a lot of developing countries are going. I mean, to me, the facts are that like we're going to need different varieties of energy, and the energy demand isn't going to slow down. And it's, until you can find some way to store energy, or, to have wind go 24 hours a day and sunshine 24 hours a day, you better learn how to store an awful lot of energy to totally replace some of these fuels. And I mean, and then, nuclear, they all have a piece of this puzzle, and it depends on each individual's country's tolerance to these levels, as I think Frank said there, and everywhere is different. And again, with nuclear, like, it's getting better and safer, and that's good. In the meantime, you had Germany shut down facilities, and you've had Japan shut down facilities. So it's gonna require a lot of different factions to continue to fuel the world there in the next 30 years. And I still believe gas will be a strong part of that. Just one known fact, like as far as developing countries go, like, the U.S. is joining the Paris Climate Accord, which, again, is let's agree on numbers we can't get to. But bottom line is the U.S. has had one of the lowest, has been dropping their emissions more than the developed countries in the past few years. And that is a huge effect of switching natural gas from coal-fired plants is a big part of that, along with some of the other renewables. So, it's still there. It's going to be here for a while.
I want to go back to what you talked about storage, obviously very important as we move towards renewables. And there just seems to be a feeling out there that there's going to be some technological breakthrough, and we're going to have improvements there. And I guess this is a question open to anybody who wants to answer it, but do you see stuff coming? Is that possible?
Anything's possible, Mike. But again, fuel cells have been these guys have been going around for 15, 20 years, and we're still not there. Like, I mean, are they getting closer? Sure, maybe. But things are getting better, and people forget, like, the products that go into these are not disposable very easily. So there's waste on the back end, like, and that seems to get just sort of lost in the whole equation. So, every time you fix something, you seem to cause a problem somewhere else, right? So, there's lots of questions to the people that have all the answers right now. I would throw out there.
Yeah, you brought up waste, and I'm going to do a quick plug before I forget. If anybody is out there and wants to ask a question, again, down the lower right, there's a little bubble you can click on, and we can get those questions out here. But since you brought up the waste, that's, especially when we're talking about solar panels, etc. It does feel like for such an environmental fuel, people are kind of forgetting about the waste component of things. Again, open to anybody if anybody wants to jump in on that while I look and see it. We got a couple questions coming in.
Yeah, let me add into what Doug said. I agree that storage is definitely an issue. Thermal energy is an issue. And people think about electricity, but customers need thermal energy. You need to heat, you need to cool, you need steam, you need chilled water. There's a lot of processes in manufacturing, or just even a hotel, hospital. There's a lot of areas where electricity is great, but that it needs to be 24/7, 365, and be base loaded. Then we still need a thermal energy component. And I think battery storage is excellent. We've done a lot of projects in battery storage with Tesla batteries or other suppliers, but they haven't met their goals and their cost targets and their performance targets, and I think they'll get there, but again, I think it's going to take longer. Doug mentioned fuel cells. I've been involved in fuel cells my whole career. They're actually invented in the 60s, right? Not 15, 20 years ago. And I remember being in conference room 25 years ago with price targets they still haven't hit today or cost for the product. And so it's challenging, and obviously volumes will help. But these technologies are achievable. It's just getting them to scale and getting them to the right price is really the challenge at the end of the day. Whether it's hydrogen, whether it's fuel cells, any of these technologies, scale and price at the end of the day is what's going to move the needle.
We do have one question coming in here, and it talks about the small modular nuclear, which, Paul, I think you touched on quickly, but for maybe some of those in the audience that aren't as familiar, would you just kind of describe what's going on with small modular nuclear?
Well, we're seeing quite a bit of support for small modular reactors, and that's simply because, first of all, it's a small, compact facility. Obviously, the cost is less compared to the capital expenditure one would need for a large what we see as our typical reactors. Plus, there's a lot of need for them in rural areas, as very much like Darren's technology. There are places where it's very appropriate to use these small modular reactors where they can generate power and provide grid level power. But in areas where it's hard to get, or it's got either unreliable power supply or et cetera. And the other thing is that the small modular reactors also are built to be a single-use technology. So in other words, you don't have to worry about removing the fuel or refueling and dealing with the fuel and handling it. You basically take the module out, that's the modular term, and replace it with a new module, just like you would with I've heard stories of or plans at several places to put in 6-packs of small modular reactors where they could just cycle them in and out as they needed to operate. And there's another level of it. It's called microreactors. And these are reactors that are like 1 megawatt type reactors that are intended, that could literally fit in the side of an aircraft and be mobile and be transported to several locations. So there was an executive order by President Trump, and I believe it's also it supports a bipartisan effort to advance these nuclear technologies. But it puts a strategy and a program to develop not only to develop and deploy small modular reactors, but also these microreactors. And the Defense Department is really big on these microreactors because they can literally airlift them in, provide power. A good example was provided me by the Department of Defense was the power outages that happened to Puerto Rico after they had their 2 hurricane strikes a couple of years ago, and but also in Alaska as well, where there's a lot of demand for this type of technology, where they're effectively they're transporting in diesel to generate electricity, and they want something more reliable.
I want to just jump in. I just want to just make a comment about fuel cells. I think Darren and Doug both brought up about fuel cells, and Darren, how long it's been in development stage. I left Texaco. My last job at Texaco in 2001 was president of Texaco Technology Ventures. And I think we invested probably close to $100 million in about a 3-year period on development of fuel cells. And if I went back and looked at that presentation and our projections, we would have all been driving fuel cell cars today. 50% of the market would be fuel cell cars today. Well, it's not there now. It is gaining popularity, obviously, in electric cars, but storage was a big part of the issue, and storage of hydrogen. We invested at the same time with the same company, hydrogen storage technologies and hydride powders and things like that. But again, those things still haven't quite developed to the stage to be really commercial. But I've been hearing a lot more talk about fuel cells again. So, we'll see. But that could be in the mix, I think, as we move forward.
You raised an interesting point. I'm a firm believer that there's no one fuel as an answer. It's important because I've seen enough cycles where you said fuel cells was going to be the answer, and I remember when natural gas was going to be the answer, and then prices change over time, and they change in reaction to how the markets are changing. Am I right? Open to everybody. Do you all agree that it's important to keep a good mix of fuels?
Yeah. Yes, I absolutely believe that.
Is there one fuel that scares people more than others? We haven't talked much about hydrogen. What's do you think hydrogen's role over the next couple decades?
Well, there's quite a bit of work being done on hydrogen generation using nuclear energy for that. Simply because it can create a byproduct as a byproduct. But I don't think I think the general public isn't quite aware of hydrogen fuel cell technology. I don't think they quite grasp it. So it's not something that's, for example, like I would hear from my Uber driver or something like that. I do hear a lot about electric cars and Teslas, but I don't hear much about fuel cell technology. So I don't think it's something that the general public has been quite aware of. I think creating the hydrogen for that technology we know what that is. And I think, as others have said, storage and application execution has been the biggest challenge.
Transportation of it too, besides the storage, just transporting it.
Yeah.
We were trying to envision, are we going to have like Texaco gas stations around the world also selling hydrogen? And it's just, it sounded good and you can make a nice business plan, but the practicality and the infrastructure costs and work was just dramatic. So, I think that still is all those infrastructure, storage, transportation issues are still there.
We're hearing a lot about blending natural gas and hydrogen together, and we've got some products commercially available right now to go up to 30% hydrogen blend. And I think that's an area a lot of countries are talking about, trying to use existing natural gas infrastructure to blend some level of hydrogen in, which I do think is interesting for natural gas to still be a fuel. And the infrastructure can't handle 100% hydrogen, obviously. So that could be another way that hydrogen gets into the market in kind of a beach entry, I call it, kind of a slower adoption phase. So I think that's very interesting. I think fuel cells are gaining in popularity. Hydrogen is being talked about more in the last year than it has in the last 10, as far as I'm concerned. So I think it's changing. You have 30% of the world's population that grew up with climate change and global warming. And now those folks are voters and consumers and becoming architects, engineers, business leaders. So I think it's gaining momentum. It's really just how fast. And I do agree, multiple fuels and multiple technologies. There's no silver bullet for any of this. These are hard questions, hard goals to achieve. You're not going to get there with only one technology or one fuel.
And we can't ignore infrastructure, what's in place, whether we're talking about utility power plants or fueling stations or what. And those are costs that have been spent. They're not going to go away easily.
What is it? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like, wasn't it, I don't know, 110 degrees in Palm Springs last summer, and they're getting blackouts, so they had no air conditioning. We got some good examples of early. Let's go to green energy and put our ducks all in that box. And what's happened? Ontario is another great example in Canada. Power prices doubled. Manufacturing companies all left, moved to the States. So it's all fine and dandy until the economics start actually affecting everybody's pocketbook. And I mean, even probably some of those 30% people that are growing up in this stage will notice that at some point in time. So, the economics of it all has got to be put into the equation, which a big part of it is, like you said, what's the infrastructure development around some of this stuff is massive.
The challenging part is a lot of the people that are pushing these agendas are politicians. They're not architects and engineers and energy experts, right? So what seems like a good idea to them, the reality of the situation, the cost of the situation, the infrastructure changes are pretty steep. So that's the big challenge we all face.
Everybody's good though until it affects their pocketbook too much, and then you start getting change again.
Or the power's out. Yep, absolutely.
At 110 in the middle of summer in California.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe go around and everyone say, what do you think that people just don't understand? We're kind of going that area. What are they not understanding about the future? Open-ended, who wants to start?
I'll start. I think it's cost. I think Doug was kind of saying that. I think, where we had a lot of success in Ontario because energy prices have gone up and people want to lower their energy costs. And so I think, when you have try to do something good, it has unintended consequences, or people only look at the positives of what they're doing. And so if you raise utility rates substantially, industrial customers, heavy energy consumers have to find a way to lower their rates or move, right, to a lower energy environment. And so if you raise taxes on businesses move. If you raise utility rates, heavy utility users will move or have to find alternative technologies like Capstone or other technologies. So I think there's always going to be winners and losers. I think most people don't realize the negative side of decisions they make or what the trade-offs are. And I think that's a little bit of the world we live in, where everything's 100% one way or another, whether it's political or otherwise. And so I think that's probably the biggest mismatch for me is green energy is great. I'm CEO of a green energy company, but there's still a cost to green energy, and there's realistic things that have to happen to make it affordable for everybody.
I'll bring up a dirty oil scenario here. So for fossil fuels, I've been in that industry while I was the head of technology ventures and tried to push green energy, and we invested about $1 billion in 2 years at Texaco in that area. Still, the consumer, and I think Darren was pointing, cost is very important to consumer, and there's a trade-off on that. And, while everybody wants to beat up the oil and gas companies and tax them more and demonstrate against them but at the same time, to go to new, cleaner energy, that still overall is more expensive. And, I think they don't quite understand the value of fossil fuels still in the economy mix. I don't care, as Michael was saying in Indonesia, are they going to go to, 31% alternative energy, renewables by 2050? Yeah, they might get there, but you know what? That means 70% still is not renewables. And I think that, the public needs to realize if they do want to get to 30% renewables or whatever in any country, it's going to cost money, and they need to contribute to that. So we either have to step up and pay the extra for renewables so that they can reduce the cost per energy produced in a renewable, or they've got to just stick with fossil fuels and realize that still is, in most cases, the lowest cost production, cost of production for energy. So, I think the public just doesn't understand that. And, I'm a big proponent. I think we should go to 30, 40, 50% renewables over the next 50 years. But, there's a cost to it. And in the meantime, fossil fuels will be making up the biggest portion of energy production still in the world today. Moving to natural gas, cleaner energy, but still fossil fuels. So
I think if you want a good example of the shock value of making these radical changes and picking winners and losers, all one has to do is look at Germany. And I can't pronounce what they call it, but the energy transformation program, where they're going to go to 50, 60% renewables and 100% renewables by 2050. I think there's something like that.
Yeah.
I think they hit 30%, and that's on wind generation, and they hit a plateau, and they couldn't put enough more generation capacity. And so what they've done is they shut the nuclear power plants down in a rational response to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster back in 2011, and they replaced it with lignite generation. The largest lignite power plant in the world is built in Germany.
Yeah.
And as a result, they're failing to meet their carbon objectives and everything else. And but they still talk about, they lecture everybody else around the world on clean energy and everything else. But the reality is they hit that. They found that their economy could not tolerate anything more than 30% because too many businesses were leaving Germany and going elsewhere in the EU with cheaper power costs. And in the U.S., when we talk about renewables and what the public perceives, they love driving through the wind, until it's in their backyard. They love going to other people's backyard and seeing those big wind generators turning slowly in the wind, but they don't actually get the chance to understand what the cost of that generation is because it's subsidized. And so when we talk about transitioning and everything else, one of the things that also gets lost is the fact that the public right now hasn't actually had an opportunity to really feel to send to other outside of blackouts and other things in certain locales. But generally, because of the overall subsidies of renewables, it's insulated the public from understanding what the cost is to go to these cleaner energy. They'll demand it, but they don't understand what the cost is to get there.
I mean, it's loading problems with too much of it, right? I mean, nuclear is different. It's got full load and natural gas and turbines and damming and everything. It's got full loads, but I mean, it's that, again, is it windy 24 hours a day? Is it sunny 24 hours a day? So you got backup, which again is inefficient, right? All of this is inefficient. And Germany is a great example. They actually shrunk, I believe. They went backwards a little bit in their renewables, if I remember right. But because you can only get so far with today's technology and cost structures. So it's going to take a lot more costs, subsidies, the odds are increased taxes, like just it's going to go on and on and on. But again, you know, we need all of them, you know, together, because again, the world's going to want more energy. That's not going to stop. And I mean, developed countries undeveloped countries want to become middle class people and more developed, and they want more of a life like, you know, we've been experiencing, and so that energy demand isn't just going away anytime soon.
I think as you opened up, Mike, you know, with the Keystone Pipeline, just because it's illogical or a bad idea doesn't mean government's not going to do it. So we got to be prepared to you know, roll with the punches and be flexible as business leaders, because certain decisions will be made that are probably not the best, you know, solutions, but are still going to happen because political will is what it is.
It's all about
I'm feeling
emotion.
the answer to my next question will be as little as possible, but what should government's role be in this whole picture? You know, we've seen the involvement and how that's helped push down renewable costs. Is there a role for government to encourage certain fuels?
I think there is. I think there should be. I think the government should be doing that. The U.S. has done it. I don't know about what other federal deductions or subsidies they have. We put solar in our house. I'm in California, so we get a lot of pretty good sun, maybe better than Doug does up in Canada. But so we get, you know, pretty good amount of sun here, and it costs a lot of money to put in that solar. But I'll tell you, I figured it out after 1 year of production. There's a 5-year payout on it. But what benefited that was that I got a big deduction on my federal income, a credit on my federal income taxes. So that helped. So that's an incentive the government made for solar. And I think government needs to make these incentives to help bring down the cost of this renewable energy. And so I think there is a role for government to play. Moving, if you just stay in fossil fuels, trying to move a mix like in Indonesia from oil towards natural gas, a cleaner fuel. So there are a lot of things government can do by helping to build new, you know, gas pipelines, things like infrastructure, things like that. So I think government has a role, an important role. I think under the Biden administration, you'll see a stronger role towards renewables, obviously. But you know, I think government should play a role, and I expect it will be, and that's going to help drive. If the government doesn't play a role, we're not going to get there in terms of increasing renewables.
In the nuclear space, we wouldn't have a nuclear industry without government.
Yeah.
I mean, we can go back and look at the Manhattan Project and everything else and the urgency behind it, but the nuclear fleet we have today, if you go to Canada, they have what's called CANDU reactors. Those are heavy water reactors. They don't produce fissile material after, or they don't create non-proliferation issues. But the U.S. has 100% light water reactors, and that was a decision made by the United States Navy and the U.S. government. They made a decision we're going to go, and so when we talk about some of the, when we look overseas, like India and other places where they're talking about putting in thorium fuel cycles and going to molten salt reactors, which thorium is part of. The U.S. toyed with those ideas back in the 60s, but the government made the decision that they were going to support one technology. And granted, it paid out. It worked just fine, but if you look at the infrastructure to build out, to provide the fuel and everything else for nuclear power plants, if the government hadn't been there at the beginning, supporting it and building it, even though laying out edicts, we wouldn't have a viable nuclear fleet now. And that's because that was new. Everybody knew oil and gas, that always been around, but this would be something that's new technology. Now they're driving for advanced reactors with accident-tolerant fuels and everything else. Without the government support, it's very likely private industry would have, particularly in today's power markets, would have the funding and the ability to be able to fund those type of technologies on a grand enough scale.
And I agree with you guys in the fact that government needs to play a role, but let's make sure they're honest about the costs. That's typically the problem. And how do you get from point A to point B, and what's the cost, and what's it going to cost individuals to get to that spot?
Yep, that's correct.
No, I agree. I think government, from like in the U.S. Department of Energy has been a great supporter of Capstone, and we wouldn't be where we are today without their support and their national labs. We're running our hydrogen product in Argonne National Lab right now in Illinois. So they help develop technologies. I do think incentives are good as long as they phase out over time and incentivize companies to get commercial as quick as possible. They don't pick winners and losers, which unfortunately with lobbying and special interests, they tend to do that, and that's something we fight. But then I think, the being honest about the cost and educating people on what you're getting and what the cost of it. I think that's an area the government's fallen down a lot because nobody wants to deliver bad news. So they always want to give the rosiest picture possible and tell people what they want to hear so they get the votes they need to get reelected.
Yep.
Do subsidies work? Does anybody like the idea of a cap and trade type of system?
I'm not a huge fan of them. Just because subsidies also insulate the real cost of, the real cost that people are paying for. I mean, obviously, there's some good examples where it works, but on a broad base and the high level, I'm not sure that subsidies are really helpful because it's basically redistributing of tax dollars, and maybe it works. I'm just not completely sold on it.
I think they got to be implemented correctly. They need to be properly sized and they need to phase out in the appropriate period of time and step down. I think part of the problem is they get put in place and they keep getting renewed and lengthened, and that's where politicians mess it up a little bit, to be honest.
Agree exactly.
As you kind of look out over the next couple of decades and we talk about how the fuel mix might change, are there infrastructure changes that need to be made? We talked a little bit about maybe a growth in LNG. Anybody see any other big infrastructure changes?
Oh, I see the power grid's going to have to improve and change. I mean, if we're going to be putting more renewables in, and whether it's with current technology or future technology, our grid was designed in the 1950s and 60s. And there's been pieces where they put in elements, of technology improvements and everything, but the way the whole thing's set up right now, it's a basket case. And California is a great example of what happened when the grid basically failed, and because it's not been updated. And of course, the story is PSEG focused on renewables and messaging and all that stuff, and not on the power lines. But the fault is the way our power markets are set up right now. They don't incentivize supporting and maintaining the infrastructure. I mean, I've worked in merchant where you have a merchant electricity grid, and what's the first thing that fails? It's the power lines, because the provider, the carrier, gets such a small part of the revenue off that power that's being delivered that they don't have enough money to put into maintaining the power lines, the transformers, and heck, even the crossbars on the power poles. And so we got to get that. That's what's going to have to be. I see, regardless of what mix of technology goes into the future, something's going to need to be done about the grid to be able to adapt to those new technologies.
It's a lot of expense, and back to what we were talking, Darren and I were talking about, people leaving the grid. Who pays for that?
Yeah.
No, I think on the natural gas side, you have similar issues. You have natural gas pipelines that are very old. Some of them are tack welded together, not seam welded. I mean, there's definitely issues on the natural gas infrastructure side as well. And if you want to add hydrogen to the natural gas infrastructure, again, that sounds great in a PowerPoint, but what that actually means is a big issue. So I agree. The electric utility and the gas utility are both 1960s, 70s vintage, and they need to be upgraded.
Well, we are getting here down to the last couple minutes, I think. Why don't think of a general question? Why don't we go around and just say what you think the biggest change 30 years from now from what we are right now, and how it might affect your fuel or your company? Frank, not to put you on the spot, but you haven't spoken for a while. Let's get you in.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think, in 30 years from now, I don't think there's going to be, I still don't think there'll be a dramatic change in the way things are in the world today. I think you'll have renewables at a much higher level. but there's still going to be the existence of oil, of natural gas, and diminished. But I still believe that's going to be a very important player in around the world in terms of the energy mix. So I think all these other technologies, whether it be nuclear or solar or geothermal or hydrogen developing and fuel cells, I think all those will be developed and will take a bigger market share. But I still think the traditional energy will still have coal, diminished a lot, but coal, clean coal, oil, and natural gas taking a bigger role. But sure, renewables will be much bigger, but still, I don't think 50%, anywhere near 50% of the energy mix.
Darren, you want to go?
I'd probably take a little different approach. I think the next 10 or 15 years aren't going to change that much, but I think it will accelerate. I think these things will hit a tipping point, and I look at our own product, and if we added scale, what the cost of it would be phenomenal. I mean, Caterpillar builds more engines in a day than I do turbines in a year. If I built as many turbines that did engines, my cost would probably be half of what Caterpillar's cost is for an engine, just because of the size and the weight of the machine. So I think there is scale, there is a tipping point. I do think that this generation that grew up with global warming and climate change is going to become a bigger player going forward, and it's going to just continue. And unfortunately, or fortunately, you can get on the green bus or get run over by it. But I think it will change, and I think it'll change slow, but then it will pick up. So maybe not 30 years, maybe it's 40 or 50 years, but I think it will change pretty substantially.
Doug, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I said before that I think you need you're going to need a whole bunch of different facets of energy sources. I mean, I guess just to expand on Frank's piece, like, renewable can move to 50%, but with that said, like, the energy demand is going to be higher 20 years from now than it is as well today. So you're still going to need a fair chunk of probably fossil fuels. And again, like, we're getting better too. Like, get the incentives to our industry as well, and then we'll get cleaner and we'll get better and we'll get smarter. I mean, in Canada, like, it's tough to flare. Like, we can't flare. I mean, in places in the States, they'll just let the gas go and produce the oil. But, we've already got some pretty high standards. And in the last 10 years, our oil sands have dropped GHG 30% in the last 10 years. So those things are there. And, but like I think I said earlier, now again, that energy demand isn't going to slow down. It's going to keep increasing. So, I mean, 50% fossil fuels in 2050 could be close to the same level we got today, or maybe slightly less. So we're going to kind of need everything to put this all together.
What do you think, Paul?
So I think that what we're going to see is a transition from where energy demand is focused in let's say North America and Europe and Japan, Korea. I think that shift is going to be, you're going to continue to see more of a shift going towards China, India, where these large populations are becoming to get less starved for electricity and energy. And they're going to be driving what the future will look like. As we live in our Western world with our Western perceptions about where we think, what's clean energy and everything else, they're what's going to be driving the global energy demand. Right now, the Chinese are rapidly gaining on the United States on energy demand or energy generation and demand. It's still taking time. They're still building a coal-fired plant once every month or two now, still. And even though they're building, starting new reactors about every 6 months, they're still growing. And I think that's what's going to be driving the energy mix going forward. And in 50 years, I think that's what's going to be driving where we see the energy economy shaking out as overseas, particularly I think India and China are going to be the biggest drivers.
Paul, you stole my answer. I was going to talk about how I think globalization is just going to continue, and we can't make blanket statements about the world. It's different from country to country, and there's a role for all fuels, not within each individual country, but globally. And I think there's going to be more shipping of stuff, more transferring of technology, but everyone's at a little bit different stage in things. And we will see how it goes. Well, this has been fun. I hope you guys had fun.
Thank you.
I think we covered a lot of topics, and don't know if we learned anything or taught anything, but it's enjoyable.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, and that concludes our panel on the energy industry.